Hey guys, tonight the story of a woman who loved the Ingalls family so much that one winter, quite gently, she asked them to give her one of their babies to keep. Her name was Ella Boast, and by the end of tonight you'll understand exactly why she asked and why no one in that little house ever held it against her. Before we go anywhere, a little soft housekeeping. If you enjoy what I do here, the slow nights and the old stories, you can subscribe and follow along, but only if you genuinely want to. No pressure. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what hour it is where you are. It's a strange comfort seeing who else is awake in the dark, and if you'd ever like to bring a little piece of this world home, our 3 little books live at prairiesecrets.com. Just scan the QR code on your screen, or, if you're listening on your phone, you'll find the links waiting in the description and the pinned comments below. No hurry at all, they'll still be there in the morning. So settle in now. Dim the lights, if they aren't already low, fan on, blanket up, get heavy. If you drift off somewhere in the middle of all this, that isn't a failure. That's the whole idea. I'll keep the fire going and stay right here. Tonight we'll follow one woman across a whole life, from a sled stuck in the snow on Dakota Christmas, all the way to a quiet grave on a rise outside town with a great deal of warmth in the miles between. Our story starts small, the way the real ones usually do. Picture a house on the north shore of a shallow lake, in the last blue light of a winter afternoon, 1879. There's a lamp already lit in the window, though it isn't quite dark yet. Inside, a girl named Laura is setting the table. Her mother is at the stove and the whole place smells of biscuit and coffee. None of them know it yet, but they're about to make the best friends they will ever have. And out on the road, still miles off in the cold, those friends are stuck fast in a snowdrift. By the time the Boasts finally reached that lit window, they had been travelling for the better part of 2 weeks, and almost none of it had gone the way they planned. Let me set the house for you first, because the house matters. It was called the Surveyor's House, and it stood alone on the north shore of Silver Lake, in what was then Dakota Territory. The railroad had built it for the men who went ahead of the tracks, the surveyors who measured the land, and when those men finished for the season and went back east, somebody had to mind the place through the winter. That somebody was Charles Ingalls, Laura's father, a lean and restless man with a fiddle and a soft spot for any horizon he hadn't crossed yet. His family moved in on the 1st of December, 1879. After years of small cabins and dugouts and rooms above other people's stores, they walked into a house that felt almost sinful in its size. 2 stories, real glass windows, more room than 5 people knew what to do with. And then there was the pantry. I have to tell you about the pantry, because Laura never got over it, and honestly neither would you. The surveyors had left the house stocked for the whole winter and simply walked away from it. Every wall was a shelf, and every shelf was full. There were dishes and pans and boxes and cans. There was a barrel very nearly full of white flour, and a second barrel of cornmeal, and a third barrel packed with fat white salt pork, sunk and held down under its own brown brine. There was a wooden box of square soda crackers. There was a box of salt fish, and a great box of dried apples, and 2 full sacks of potatoes, and a sack of beans very nearly to the top. For a family that had known real hunger, that had counted potatoes by the single potato in harder years, a pantry like that was not just food. It was safety you could stand inside of. Ma Ingalls, a careful woman who did not waste words or flour, must have stood in that doorway and felt her shoulders come down from around her ears for the first time in a long while. That house did more than shelter one family as it happened. Standing where it did, alone on the shore at the edge of the settled world, it turned into a kind of unofficial hotel all that first winter. Homesteaders and land seekers passing through the country, caught out by weather or distance or plain bad luck, would spot the one big lit house on the lake and make for it, and be taken in and fed and given a corner of the floor to sleep on and sent along in the morning. It was that kind of household in that kind of country. You helped whoever the cold blew to your door because next time it might well be you out in it, riding through the dark towards somebody else's window. The Ingalls had learned that the hard way over a lot of hard years, and they lived by it without having to think about it. So when 2 half-frozen strangers, on 2 tired horses, came out of the night that December, the door did not hesitate for a second. It never did. opening up to whoever the night delivered was simply how people stayed alive out there, and how, every now and again, they happened to make the truest friends of their whole lives. So that is the warm, well-lit, well-stocked house on the shore. Now, the road. Coming up from Iowa that same winter were Robert and Ella Boast, a married couple looking for a piece of the same new country. Robert had already met Charles Ingalls that autumn, back on the 1st of September, out at the noisy railroad camp where the grading crews were throwing up the roadbed. The two men had liked each other on sight, the way you sometimes just do, and that liking would outlast almost everyone in this story. Robert had filed on a homestead of his own, a quarter section about 2.5 miles east of the spot where the town of De Smet was about to be born. He and Ella meant to get up there and settle in near their claim before the worst of the weather closed the country down. The weather did not cooperate, it rarely does in these stories. Their sled was heavy, loaded with everything two people need to start a life on bare prairie, and the snow came deep and early. Day by day they fell further behind their own plans, and then, about 6 miles short of the Ingalls house, in the failing light, the loaded sled drove into a drift and stuck, and no amount of coaxing the horses would bring it free. Think about that for a moment. 6 miles. In town that is a short drive you would not think twice about. Out there, in that cold, with the dark coming down and the wind picking up, 6 miles was a serious and even dangerous distance. They had a choice to make, and they made the sensible one. They unhitched the 2 horses from the stranded sled, left their whole loaded life sitting there in the snow, climbed up bareback and rode the last long miles in toward the only light on the lake. You can imagine how they looked when the Ingalls door finally opened. Snow to the knees, faces stiff with cold. 2 strangers on 2 tired horses, out of the dark, at the far edge of nowhere. And you can imagine too how fast a family like the Ingalls pulled them inside. The fire was built up, the kettle went on. There were dry things to put on and hot things to drink, and chairs pulled close to the stove, and that particular deep animal relief of being warm when you had been very cold. The horses were seen to. The wind was shut outside where it belonged. And here is where Ella Boast and her husband walk properly into the story, because of what they brought into that room besides frostbite. Robert Boast, it turned out, had a laugh. Not a polite laugh. A big, rolling, helpless kind of laugh. The sort that, in Laura's own telling, was so full and so catching that everyone in the room would be laughing along before they even knew what the joke had been. You know the kind of person who changes the temperature of a room just by stepping into it, who makes a hard week feel survivable simply by finding it funny. That was Robert Boast. And Ella, at his side, was warmth of a quieter kind, a woman easy to be near, quick to help, the sort who was already up and drying dishes in a stranger's kitchen, as though she had always lived there. The storm, in the end, was kind. This particular winter, the winter of 1879 into 1880, turned out to be a gentle one, almost a mercy, and the deep snow that had trapped the Boast sled was very nearly gone again within a week or 2. The next day was Christmas, and the 2 families spent it together in the big warm house as if they had planned it that way for years. There was jackrabbit, roasted. There were mashed potatoes and beans and warm biscuit and dried apple pie and tea. And the Ingalls girls, caught out by these sudden guests, went scrambling to make little gifts by hand so that the Boasts would not go without on Christmas morning, because that is simply what you did. Nobody in that room knew they were at the beginning of anything. That is the thing about beginnings. They almost never announce themselves. They just look like an ordinary good evening with the snow shut out and someone laughing by the fire. But a friendship started in that house that would run for more than 40 years, through hard winters and good harvests, through births and deaths, and one very tender, very difficult question that we'll come to in its own time. It started here, with 2 half-frozen strangers and a family that had food to spare and hearts to match. And then the evening wound down the way good evenings do. The dishes were done and put back on those crowded shelves. The fire was banked low. The talk went soft, and then softer. Somebody yawned, and it went around the room the way Mr. Boast's laugh had. The lamp that had guided the Boasts in from the snowdrift was lifted off the windowsill at last and carried up the stairs to bed. And the first night of a very long friendship went quietly, gratefully dark. To understand why that laugh mattered so much, and why the quieter woman beside it mattered even more, we have to step back from the lake for a while, back before Dakota to Iowa, where Ella Boast came from. Her name, before it was Boast, was Ella Rosina Peck. She came from Grundy County, Iowa, out of a family that had done what nearly everyone in this story had done, which is to move, slowly and steadily, generation after generation from the east toward the setting sun. Here is a small thing that the people who have spent their lives with these families have noticed, and it tells you almost everything about how that whole world worked. The same last names keep turning up in the same places. That is not chance. People did not move to random spots on the map. They moved toward other people they already knew. One family goes out to the newest edge of things, survives a winter, and writes a letter home. Come on out, the letter says the land is good, the water's fine, and half the old neighbourhood reads that letter and starts packing. So the map fills up not in a smooth wash, but in streams, family following family along the same worn grooves. Grundy County, Iowa, a county of maybe 6,000 people all told, ended up so thick with Pecks that you could hardly stir them with a stick, and with a few other names that will start to sound familiar before this night is through. Robert had come from farther off than that. He was born away up north, in Canada, in the province of Quebec, and he came down into the States as a young man, barely out of his teens, looking for farmland. He found it in Iowa. He was some years older than Ella. He met her there, in that thick tangle of families, and in 1869 he married her. They were farming people, and so they farmed. Iowa in those years was good black ground, and for a decade the two of them worked it together and kept a house, and were, by every outward sign, a settled and respectable couple, with only the one thing missing from the picture. Robert had brothers and a scatter of cousins who had come down out of Canada with him, or trailed after him, so there was family near, the way there nearly always was in that world. It was a full enough life. But these were the years of the great going west, when the government was all but giving land away to anyone willing to live on it and turn it over, and the talk in every Iowa kitchen was of Dakota, of the free quarter sections opening up along the new railroad, of the fresh start a bold couple might make on ground that cost nothing but the nerve to stay on it. Robert Boast had nerve to spare, and a restlessness in him not so different from the one that kept moving Charles Ingalls west his whole life. So like half the county, the Boasts caught the fever. They sold up what they had and loaded a sled with the rest, and pointed themselves north and west toward a territory most of their neighbours had never laid eyes on, chasing the very same dream that was pulling the Ingalls family along the very same iron rails in the very same season. Two households, strangers to each other still, drawn up the same railroad toward the same shallow lake, about to run into each other in the best possible way a person can. Now do a little quiet arithmetic with me, the gentle kind. Nothing you have to hold on to. Robert and Ella married in 1869. They did not point their sled at Dakota until the very end of 1879. That is 10 years. 10 years of marriage, 10 years of keeping house together, 10 years of one farm and then another. And in all of those 10 years, in all of those houses, there had never once been a child. There is no ledger that records what that was like for her. There rarely is for the quiet sorrows. The census taker comes around and writes down the people who are actually in the house. He has no column, no line, no box at all, for the ones a woman hoped for and prayed for and did not get. We know the fact of it. We do not get to know the shape of it, the exact weight of it, on an ordinary Tuesday, and maybe that is only right. Some griefs are nobody else's business, even 150 years later. But here is what the friends and neighbours did see, and what they remembered, and what comes down to us plainly. Ella Boast took all of that unspent tenderness, that whole great store of love that had nowhere obvious to go, and she poured it outward, into her husband, into her friends, into other people's children and other people's kitchens, and a home whose door never seemed to be shut. You've very likely known a couple like the Boasts somewhere in your own life. No children of their own, and somehow everybody's favourite aunt and uncle. The house where the neighbourhood kids all end up on a long afternoon. The ones who never forget a birthday, who always have something warm on the stove and time to sit with you. That was who the Boasts were becoming, out there on the cold shore of Silver Lake. And they were landing among exactly the right people for it, because the Ingalls world was that same kind of world, small and woven and warm. When Caroline Ingalls, Laura's mother, had first arrived at the railroad camp that autumn and discovered her own Uncle Henry already there, already working, she was not surprised in the slightest. Out in that country, running into your own family was not the coincidence. Not running into your family. That would have been the strange thing. It was a land held together with kinship the way a quilt is held together with thread, and the Boasts, with no children to make thread of their own, were about to stitch themselves right into the middle of the Ingalls family instead. So that was Ella Boast, before she was anything to Laura. A peck of Grundy County, 10 years a wife, no cradle in the house, and a great deal of love looking for somewhere to land. She carried all of that north behind 2 tired horses into a territory that had no idea yet how much it was going to need her. The lamp on the Ingalls sill burned on through the cold, and the old year quietly ran itself out. The first real test of that brand new friendship came almost at once, on the very first day of the brand new year. By then the Boasts had gotten themselves up onto their own claim and into a house of their own, if you can call it a house. It was a claim shanty, one of those first quick shelters a homesteader threw up to prove he was living on his land, and it was small. Not cosy small, genuinely comically small. 1 room, and not a large one. And into that single room, on New Year's Day of 1880, Robert and Ella Boast cheerfully invited the entire Ingalls family for a party. The logistics alone are worth picturing. Once the table was set up in the middle of that one room, there was simply nowhere left to walk, no path around it. So the guests could not just wander in and find a seat. They had to come in through the outside door and edge around to their places at the table, one person at a time, in careful order, each one sliding into place so the next one could get by. And when the meal was over, and it was time to go, the whole thing had to run in reverse. The first person to leave was the last person who had squeezed in. Laura remembered that evening warmly for the rest of her life, and when she wrote it down years later, she reached for scripture to describe it, laughing that they had gone in and out by the good book's own rule, that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And then there was what they ate, which is the part that always stops people. On a frozen prairie, hundreds of miles from the nearest salt water in any direction, the Boasts served oysters. Real oysters. I know how that sounds. It sounds like something got garbled in the retelling. It didn't. By 1880, the railroads and the new miracle of sealing food up in tin cans had carried the oyster clear across the country. Packed in a can, an oyster could ride the rails from the coast to the middle of Dakota Territory and sit on a general store shelf out there, just as happily as in a shop back east. So the Boasts opened their cans and made a hot oyster stew, and set it out with honey, and with a sauce made from fruit they had dried themselves back in Iowa, and hauled all this way in the sled. Somebody, later, called that evening the first oyster festival in Kingsbury County, and for all anyone knows, it truly was. Sit with the sweet absurdity of that for a second. 11 people or so packed shoulder to shoulder into one tiny room, around a steaming supper of shellfish, in a place where the nearest living oyster was probably 1,000 miles away through the snow. If that is not a small, everyday miracle of the modern world, I honestly don't know what would qualify. And nobody at that table was marvelling at the shipping logistics. They were just warm and fed and together and telling stories and laughing, with Robert Boast setting the whole room off again and again the way he did. There is a specific kind of happiness that only happens when you're packed just slightly too tight into a warm room with people you love. Nobody can get up without 2 other people shifting. You're practically sitting in each other's laps. The plates keep bumping, and it is, somehow, perfect. That is what the Boasts gave the Ingalls family on the first day of 1880, and it is a fair picture of what they would go on giving them for the next 40 years. Not grand things. Small, crowded, generous, laughing things. Then the party wound down, as parties do. And one by one, last in and first out, in that strict reverse order, the guests edged back around the table and out through the door into the mild dark. That winter mercifully stayed gentle, stayed. killing cold that this same country would become famous for was still a full year off, waiting its turn. So they stepped out under an easy sky, full and happy, and the little house on the claim seemed to let out a long breath behind them. It had held a whole winter's worth of joy in one small room for one evening, and that was plenty for now. The winter let go early that year, as I said, and what came up out of the thawing prairie in the spring of 1880 was not grass alone. It was a whole town. The railroad had staked out a town site on that empty ground and given it a name. They called it de Smet, after a man named Father Pierre-Jean de Smet, a Belgian priest, a Jesuit missionary who had travelled among the native peoples of the Northern Plains a generation earlier and left his name sprinkled across the maps behind him. The railroad companies named their little town stops about the way you would name a litter of kittens, quickly and without much fuss, one after another down the line, and this one came up to Smet. Nobody living there had ever met the man. It did not matter. The name stuck to the grass, and it is stuck there still. And once the snow was off and the ground lay open, the people came. They came on every train that pulled in. They came in wagons over the muddy spring roads. They poured into that quiet country in a single season, all of them after the same thing: free land, a fresh start, a quarter section of their very own for nothing but the promise to live on it and work it. Where a few months before there had been a lake, one big house, and grass clear to the round edge of the world, now there were survey stakes driven in rows and lumber piled in the mud, and the racket of hammers going from first light until dark. A main street took shape almost faster than you could watch it. Buildings went up green and quick, the fresh pine boards still weeping sap in the sun, the whole place smelling of cut wood and turned earth and possibility. The Ingalls were right in the thick of it. That year Charles took up a homestead claim of his own, 160 acres of prairie just southeast of the brand new town, and he set about proving it up. He put up a building in the town itself too, on the main street, because a man with a foot in both the land and the town had two ways of making $1, and Charles Ingalls never met a plan he did not like the look of. And the Boasts were out on their own claim to the east of town, doing the same hard, hopeful, back-breaking work of turning bare grass into a farm and a future. So there they were, both families, among the very first citizens of a town that had not existed at all the year before. Founders, though nobody bothered with such a grand word for it. They were simply early. They had gotten there in that first soft winter before the rush, and now they stood and watched the rush arrive, and the town climb up out of the mud board by board, and the empty country they had ridden into on tired horses fill right up with strangers and hammers and hope. I wish I could give you that first Dakota summer the way they had it. The light alone would undo you. Summer light on the northern plains is an enormous thing. The days stretched long and gold, the sun up before 4 in the morning and not down again until after 9 at night, and in between, a sky so wide it makes your chest ache. The meadowlarks sang from the tops of the tall grass. The wild prairie roses came out pink along the low places. The wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves the way it moves over water, all day, every day, that endless patient prairie wind. And at night, for the first time ever on that shore, there were lamps. Not one lonely lamp burning on a dark lake. Lamps, a whole little scattering of them, lit windows spread out across the new town and the new claims, each one a family that had bet its entire future on the same patch of grass, each one a small warm answer to all that enormous dark. Sit in that hope with them for a minute, because they had earned it, and they did not know how long it would last. Every soul in that country had come out and gambled everything on this place turning good, and that first summer it truly looked as though it might. The grass stood high, the town was rising, the trains ran in and out, loaded with lumber and people and mail. The future was as broad and open and forgiving as the sky over it. You know that particular feeling, maybe, the first good season in a new place, before you have any idea what the winters are like there, when everything is still ahead of you and nothing has gone wrong yet. That was de Smet in the summer of 1880. And it is a kindness, in a way, that none of them could see the next winter coming, because it meant that for one whole golden season they got to simply stand in their new country and believe it would be gentle with them. Robert and Ella Boast believed it, out on their claim to the east. The Ingalls believed it, on their homestead to the south. The whole hopeful, hammering, sunburned town believed it, and the new town settled down each night under those huge prairie stars with all its little lamps burning in a loose constellation on the dark ground, none of them knowing yet what was on its way. Every one of them, for now, just glad to be there at the beginning of something. It is worth staying with Robert Boast a moment longer before we go on, because a friendship like this one is really two friendships braided together, and the one between the two men, Robert and Charles, held up a great deal of the rest. Robert had come to Dakota by way of hard work, the way most of them did. He was a farmer by trade, but in that year of 1879 he had hired on with the railroad, the Chicago and Northwestern, which was shoving its line westward across the territory a mile of graded dirt at a time. He worked the grading crews, which was brutal labour, moving the earth by horse and scraper and human back to build up the long, low roadbed the tracks would sit on. That is how he happened to be out at the camp near Silver Lake that September, and how he happened to meet a like-minded wanderer named Charles Ingalls. In July of that same year, Robert had filed a claim of his own on the open prairie east of where the surveyors had staked out the future town. So he was both things at once, a railroad man earning wages and a homesteader proving up his own ground, which was a common enough way to get a start when a man had more ambition than money. That grading work was no small thing to survive, by the way, let alone to do with a laugh still in you. Building a railroad in those days meant building the ground for it first, by hand and by horse, a long raised bed of earth running arrow straight across the prairie, high enough to hold the tracks up out of the snow and the spring water. Men and teams moved that dirt one scraper load at a time, 10 and 12 hours a day, in the heat and the wind and the biting dust, for wages that were fair enough but never generous. It was the kind of labour that used a man up and left him old before his time. Robert Boast did it, and kept his good humour all the way through it, and came home from it to prove up a homestead and build a future on the side. Whatever else you might say about the man, he was not afraid of work, and he did not let the hard work turn him bitter, and out on that frontier that was worth more than any amount of cleverness a person could bring. Now let me jump you forward in time for just a moment, 30 years down the road, to show you the kind of man Robert Boast stayed. There is a small notice in a De Smet newspaper from the year 1909. By then, Robert is an older man, long settled, and the paper is singing his praises for the simplest thing. All that winter, it says, Robert Boast has been going up and down the streets of the town with his own horse and a snowplough, clearing the deep snow off the wooden sidewalk so that his neighbours, the old ones especially, can get around without wading. Sit with that a moment. Here is a man who once rode in half frozen out of a snowdrift himself, a stranger in the dark hoping for a lit window, and 30 years on he's spending his cold mornings making sure that nobody else in his town has to fight the drifts alone. That is not a grand gesture. It never made him famous. It is just a decent man with a horse, doing a kindness before breakfast over and over, for years, because it needed doing. That was the man Ella had married. And you can see, can't you, how the two of them fit. His big laugh and her quiet steadiness, his way of filling a room and her way of holding one together. He was the sort of neighbour you would want on the worst day of your life, and she was the sort you would want on every other day. Between them they had no children to spend all of that on, so they spent it on the whole county instead. If you have ever complained about shoveling your own driveway, and I certainly have, Robert Boast and his 30 winters of other people's sidewalks are here to gently put that in perspective. The town was rising around the two of them now, board by board. De Smet was becoming a real place, with a main street and a church and stores, and the Boasts and the Ingalls were woven into the middle of it. For a little while, in that first mild season, it must have seemed as though the hard part was behind them all, as though they had chosen well and the land would be kind. The lamp burned warm in the window, the friendship was set, everything was in place, and everything was good. Which is, of course, exactly the moment the country chose to show them what it could really do. The gentle winter the Boasts had arrived in turned out to be the Prairie's way of coaxing everyone in close, because the very next winter, the winter of 1880 into 1881, that same country pulled back its kind face and showed the other one underneath. They still call it the hard winter. Laura would one day fill an entire book with it. and not one word of that book is an exaggeration. It began in October, far too early, with a blizzard that buried the young crops, and after that the storms simply did not stop. One would blow itself out after 3 or 4 days of screaming white, and the people would dig out, and before they could breathe, the next one was on them. This went on, storm after storm after storm, from October clear through until April. 7 months. Think of your own hardest week of weather, the one that made the news where you live, and then imagine it did not end, and instead came back again every few days for more than half a year. The trains were the first thing to go, the railroad cuts, the places where the line ran down between banks of earth, filled up with packed snow faster than any crew could dig them clear. The company sent men and ploughs, and they fought it for weeks, and then they lost. Around the middle of that winter, the railroad simply gave up until spring, and the little town of De Smet, along with every soul in it, was cut off from the outside world. No trains meant no coal. No trains meant no flour. No trains meant no fresh anything for months, with the stores already thin. So the people did what people do. When the coal ran out, they twisted hay. They took the slough grass they had cut for the animals and they twisted it by hand into tight, hard sticks that would burn, one after another all day long, just to keep a stove barely warm, because a hay stick burns up in minutes and a body has to keep twisting. When the flour ran out, they ground wheat, seed wheat, meant for the spring planting, run through the little coffee mill on the wall a cupful at a time, turned by hand until somebody's arm gave out and somebody else took over, just to have coarse brown bread to eat. And through all of it, the wind. That is the part the books can only gesture at. The sound of the thing. The way a true Dakota blizzard does not blow so much as scream, hour after hour, day after day, a solid wall of white noise leaning on the little houses until a person could hardly hear their own thoughts. The cold came right into the houses with the sound. On the worst mornings there was frost on the heads of the nails driven into the inside walls, frost stiffening the quilts, where a sleeper's breath had settled all night, a skin of ice on the water pail beside the stove. The days were short and getting shorter, and there was little enough light left to burn, so the long evenings were dark as well as bitter, and there was nothing to do in them. That is the part people forget about a winter like that one. It was far more than dangerous. It was crushing, grinding, endlessly dull. Weeks and then months of the same few rooms, the same wind, the same brown bread and weak tea, the same twisting of hay and grinding of wheat by hand. No news from anywhere at all because no train could break through. No way of knowing whether this blizzard was the last one or only the next in a line of them stretching past the edge of hope. It wore people down in the spirit fully as much as in the body, that grey sameness, that not knowing. And still, somehow, they kept twisting the hay and kept grinding the wheat and kept getting up to do it again the next morning, because the only other choice on offer was to stop, and out there, that winter, stopping meant dying. This is where the true character of a place shows itself, by the way. Not in the good seasons, when everyone has plenty and the door swings open easy. It shows in the lean, frightened, buried months, when a family with a little extra has to decide whether to share it with a neighbour who has none, not knowing when the train might come, not knowing if they will need it themselves before this is over. And out there, again and again, the people shared. They checked on the old ones and the sick ones. They passed what they had along the line of houses hand to hand, and the line held. It is very nearly the whole reason any of them lived to see the grass again. The Boasts and the Ingalls, who had already shown each other what kind of neighbours they were in that first easy Christmas, were that same kind of neighbour now, in the hard dark, when it was no longer easy at all, when it cost something real to be kind. That is who they were. The winter only proved it. 2 young men of the town, one of them named Almanzo Wilder, though he is not yet part of Ella's story, rode their sleds out onto the open prairie between 2 blizzards, gambling their lives on the weather, to find a homesteader rumoured to have wheat, and buy it, and haul it back so that the town would not starve. That is how close it came. It came that close. I'm not going to keep you long in the cold, because there is no need to. You already understand it. Real people that you have come to like tonight were out in that hungry and frightened and grinding seed wheat by hand in the dark, for months, not knowing when or whether it would end. Ella and Robert Boast were somewhere in that same buried white country, keeping themselves alive exactly like everyone else, no laughing now, just enduring, the way the whole territory endured. But here is the mercy, and it is a real one, so let it land. They lived. Every one of them in this story lived. The storms finally broke in the spring, and the sun came back and did its slow work, and one day in May the first train in months came whistling into De Smet with the town pouring out to meet it. The people dug themselves back up into the daylight, thinner and quieter and a great deal tougher than they had been in the fall. The Boasts were still there, the Ingalls were still there, the friendship was still there. Deeper now for having come through the worst thing any of them would ever see. And that terrible winter is long, long over now. It ended almost 150 years ago. You can let it be over. You have nowhere to be but warm. The spring that finally broke that winter came on like a door swinging open, and on the far side of it waited the most precious thing in the world, which is an ordinary life. The trains ran again, the stores filled up. The town of De Smet, which had very nearly been erased that winter, dug in its heels and decided to become a real town after all, and through the years that followed it did exactly that. You could watch it happen, board by board, if you were standing where the Boasts and the Ingalls were standing. A main street took shape, false-fronted stores along both sides of it, a depot, homes going up on the side streets, each one a household staking everything it had on this square of Prairie, and a church, the first congregational church, which Charles Ingalls himself helped to organise and raise, a plain white building where the whole small world of the town gathered on Sundays, and where, you can be sure, Robert and Ella Boast were most weeks to be found in a pew not far from their friends. This was the good stretch. This was the reward for the hard winter, years of it, the settling in years, and the two families spent them side by side. Now, let me put the two households next to each other for you, because in the difference between them lives the whole quiet ache of this story, and it never once turned into bitterness, which is the loveliest thing about Ella Boast. Go into the Ingalls house on any given evening in those years, and it was full of girls. There was Mary, the eldest, gentle and grave, who had lost her eyesight to a terrible illness back before the family ever reached Dakota, and who read the world now with her fingers and her ears. There was Laura, quick and brown and stubborn, already teaching school herself by the age of 15 to help send Mary away to a special college for the blind over in Iowa. There was Carrie, small and a little frail and sharp as a tack, and there was Grace, the baby of them all, born in 1877, a round fair little girl growing up in a house that revolved, in its gruff undemonstrative way, around the four of them. Caroline Ingalls had her hands full and her heart fuller. Whatever else that family lacked, and they lacked plenty over the years, they were never short of daughters. Now cross the way and go into the Boast house, and it was quiet, clean and warm and welcoming and quiet. There was Robert and there was Ella and there was the space where children were not. She kept a good house. Everyone said so. She cooked and she sewed and she put up the garden, and she was, by every account that survives, one of the pleasantest women in the county to spend an afternoon with. But when the afternoon was over and the guests went home, the house she and Robert sat in of an evening did not have the sounds in it that the Ingalls house had. No small feet on the stairs, no squabbling to be hushed, no child to be sent to bed and then sent back to bed again. It is not hard to imagine, is it, what it was for Ella Boast to love those Ingalls girls the way she plainly did, and then to walk home to her own still rooms, to hold Grace on her knee, to help Carrie with a bit of sewing, to sit and listen to blind Mary work out a hymn, and to feel the whole warm weight of them, and to want, with everything in her, one of her own. Family memory is gentle about this. It says only that she loved children, that she was wonderful with them, that other people's little ones adored her. Reading between those kind lines, you can feel the shape of the thing underneath. Some people who cannot have the thing they want most turn hard around the empty place. Ella Boast did the opposite. She turned soft. She became the aunt of every child who wandered through her door, and she gave that away freely, year after year, and if it cost her something to do it, She did not make anyone else carry the bill. You would have liked her. I am fairly sure of that. The women watching tonight especially. I think you already know her, because you have been her, or you have loved her, or you have sat in her kitchen. She is the one who is happy for everyone else, and does not mention her own sore spot. She is the one holding the baby at the party a beat longer than necessary, and handing it back with a smile, and going to help with the dishes so nobody sees her face for a minute. Through those years, the friendship only deepened. The Boasts were at the Ingalls table and the Ingalls at the Boast table so often that the two families half ran together. When there was trouble, they turned to each other. When there was joy, they shared it. Robert and Charles talked crops and horses and the endless business of proving up a claim. Caroline and Ella talked the way women talk who trust each other completely, which is to say about everything and about nothing, over mending in the good long silences that only close friends can share without filling. And the lamp that had once pulled two frozen strangers in off the road now burned, most nights, for people who were not strangers at all anymore. They were the nearest thing to family that friendship can make. So that was the shape of it, all through the middle 1880s. A full house and a quiet house, 2 doors apart, and a love running back and forth between them that asked for nothing. It was as settled and as sweet as anything in this story ever got. And it is a good place to pause and take a breath, because the quiet house was about to be tested in a way that a person does not plan for and cannot practice. The lamp is low and the evening soft, so I will mention one small thing. If these prairie nights, the snow at the window and the lamp turned down, are the feeling you come here for, we put 10 of them in a little book, Evenings on the Prairie, over at prairiesecrets.com. No pressure, it keeps until morning. Right now there is a baby coming, so let us not miss her. The baby came in the winter of 1886, and to understand what she meant you have to know how the family had been growing up while the friendship held. Laura Ingalls had not stayed a quick brown girl teaching school for long. A young homesteader had been driving out through the cold all one winter to fetch her home on the weekends from the school where she boarded, 12 miles each way behind a fast team, courting her without ever quite saying so. His name was Almanzo Wilder, and in August of 1885, Laura married him. She was 18. She became Laura Ingalls Wilder, the name the whole world would one day know, though nobody out there knew it yet, and she moved a few miles off to the tree claim Almanzo was proving up north of town. She was a wife now, with a house of her own, and the Boasts, who had watched her grow from a child, were as glad of it as her own parents were. Then, on the 5th of December, 1886, Laura had a daughter. They named her Rose, and into that little circle of prairie families, the Ingalls and the Wilders and the Boasts, came the first baby of the next generation. A brand new person, pink and loud and entirely herself. You can picture how it went. The visits, the passing of the baby from arms to arms, and Ella Boast, who by this winter had been a married woman for 17 years without a child of her own, taking that warm new weight against her shoulder. 17 years. Think of everything that is 17 years long. And in all of it, she had never once had this, the specific thing she was holding right now, a baby that belonged to her. She had held plenty of other women's babies. She had held Grace and cooed over Carrie and been aunt to half the county. This was no different in the plain facts of it. She would hold the baby a while and then hand it back. Except this time, something in Ella Boast did not want to hand it back. I want to tell this part carefully, because it would be so easy to tell it wrong, to make it strange or grasping or sad in a cheap way. And it was none of those things. It was one of the most human things in this whole long story. What happened is that Ella Boast looked at that baby, and then she looked at Laura, her dear young friend who was only 18 and married and healthy and standing at the very start of a whole life of children. And Ella asked her for the baby, not to hold, to keep. She asked Laura to give Rose to her. Laura wrote it down herself years later, in the pages that became the last of her books, so we are not guessing at the bones of it. In Laura's own telling, Mrs. Boast wanted the baby so badly, so openly, that she asked whether Laura might not just let her have this one. The reasoning, spoken or unspoken, was as gentle as it was piercing. "You are so young, Laura. You and Almanzo will surely have more." And the way the story comes down through the family, Ella and Robert even offered to give their best horse in trade, as though love like that could be squared up with a good animal, as though anything could. A horse for a daughter. It sounds absurd when you say it flat like that. It was not absurd in that room. It was a woman who had waited the better part of 2 decades, holding the thing she had waited for and hearing her own heart speak before her manners could stop it. Now here is the part I love, and the reason this is a story worth staying awake for. Nobody in that room got angry. Laura did not recoil, or take offence, or go cold. Laura said no. Of course she said no. Rose was her own daughter, her own heart walking around outside her body, and there was never any question of it. But Laura understood exactly what she was looking at when she said it. She was looking at love with nowhere to go. She was looking at her friend, whom she had known since she was a little girl on the shore of Silver Lake, saying out loud the one thing that friend had never let herself say in 17 years. And Laura kept her baby, and kept her friend, both, and never held the asking against Ella for the rest of their lives. That is a rare kind of grace, on both sides of it. The grace to ask for too much without shame, and the grace to refuse without wounding. Sit in that for a moment, because it is the centre of everything tonight. 2 women in a warm room, and a baby between them, and a want so big and so old that it finally just said itself. There is no villain in it. There is no shame in it. There is only how much a person can love a child that is not hers, and how gently a friend can say, "This one is mine," and go on loving her anyway. If you have ever wanted something for years that other people seem to get without even trying, you know a little of what was in Ella Boast that day. If you have ever had to smile and hand back the thing you would have given anything to keep, you know it better than I could tell you. And if you have ever been on the other side, holding your own good fortune while someone you love aches beside you, and finding a way to be kind about it, then you know the whole of it. It is one of the quietest, hardest chapters of an ordinary life, and these 2 women walked through it without breaking anything, and stayed friends on the far side. That is not weakness. That is about the strongest thing people do, and I think that is exactly why the memory stayed with Laura her whole long life, and why she set it down on paper at the very end, when she could so easily have left it out. It was not a comfortable thing to remember. A dear friend had asked for her child, and she had said no, and there is an ache in that, on both sides, that never fully closes over. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to leave it in the dark, but Laura understood, I think, that it was one of the truest things she ever stood witness to, this whole business of wanting and not having, and loving anyway. She had seen, up close, in a woman she adored, the precise shape of a longing that most people carry hidden their entire lives and never once let out into the light. And she chose, decades later, to write it down plainly and tenderly, without ever making Ella small or strange in the telling, because she wanted us to see her friend whole, the warmth and the want together, the way she herself had seen her. That is a gift Laura gave Ella. Across all those years and all those miles, she would not give her the baby. But she gave her this instead, a place in the story, set down with love, so that 150 years on, you and I could sit here in the dark and understand exactly who Ella Boast was, and ache for her a little, and not think one single unkind thing. The baby, Rose, stayed with her mother naturally, and grew up to be a clever and difficult and altogether extraordinary woman, a writer like her mother, who travelled the world and never had children of her own either, which is one of those small strange rhymes that real life leaves lying around. And Ella Boast handed the baby back, and smoothed her apron, and went home to Robert and the quiet house. She would love that child and every other child in her reach for the rest of her days. She had asked for the moon, once, out loud, in front of a friend, and then she had done the only thing there was to do, which was to keep on being who she was, warm and generous and open-handed in a house that stayed quiet. The lamp went home with her, the evening closed over it, and somewhere across the dark fields in another house, a baby that had been wanted by 2 women slept soundly. Wanted, in the arms of the one she belonged to. Here is the thing about the wheel of wanting and losing children. It does not turn only for the women without them. It turns for everyone. And in the years right after Ella asked for that baby, it turned hard for Laura, the young friend who had said no. The first 4 years of Laura and Almanzo's marriage were, to put it plainly, a run of bad luck that would have broken tougher people than they were. And they were tough. The crops failed under hail and drought and heat, year after year, and the debts piled up the way debts do when the sky will not cooperate. Then, in the spring of 1888, both of them came down with diphtheria, a savage illness in those days, and though they both survived it, Almanzo did not come all the way back. He went back to his work too soon, before his body was ready, and he suffered what was likely a stroke, and it left him, at barely past 30, needing a cane to walk for the rest of his long life. The strong young man who had driven 12 miles through blizzards to court her was, after that, a man who moved carefully and slowly and with pain. And then the hardest thing. In the summer of 1889, Laura had a second baby, a boy this time. He was born healthy, or seemed so, and for a few days that little house had in it exactly the thing Ella Boast had asked for and been refused, a brand new child. And then, when he was less than a month old, before they had even settled on a name for him, the baby boy took ill and died. Just like that. Here and then gone, in under 4 weeks. There is nothing to say about a thing like that, and I am not going to reach for anything, because there are no words that improve it. A young mother, still weak herself, with a husband on a cane, buried her son in the Dakota ground, and then, a few weeks later, watched her house burn to the ground on top of it. That was the summer of 1889 for Laura Ingalls Wilder. Now hold those two women in your mind at the same time, because this is the tender heart of the whole thing. Ella Boast, who had wanted a child for 20 years and been given none, and Laura, who had a child and then had another, and had to give that one back to the ground before he was a month old. The one who ached for a baby and the one who buried a baby, and they were friends, in the same small town, at the same time. Neither of them could fix the other. Ella could not take Laura's grief, and Laura could not answer Ella's longing. All either of them could do was what people can always do for each other, which is to show up and sit close and put the kettle on and not say the wrong thing. And that, from everything we know of the Boasts, is exactly what they did. When you have wanted a child that badly, you do not begrudge a grieving mother her tears. You just come over and you help, and you love what is in front of you. There is a hard-won wisdom in that, the kind a person only earns by living long enough to be disappointed. When you are young, you tend to think love is mostly about getting the thing you want. Ella Boast had wanted a child for 20 years and had not been given one, and it had taught her the opposite lesson, the deeper and truer one, which is that love is very largely about what you do with the wanting. Once you understand the wanting will not be answered. You can let it turn you sour, or you can let it turn you into the person who is gentlest of all, with everyone else who is aching. Ella had chosen gentle years before, quietly, without any fuss. And now, in Laura's worst summer, that old choice came back around and blessed her friend. Laura, grieving, did not have a bitter woman living down the road from her. She had the softest and kindest one in the whole county, a woman who knew to the bone what it was to want and not have, and who therefore knew, better than anyone, how to come sit with a person in the dark and not say one foolish word. You already know this in your own life, I think, that the people who have carried the same weight you carry, or a matching one, are often the gentlest with you when yours gets heavy. Sorrow does not always make people hard. Sometimes it files them down into something soft enough to be a comfort. Ella Boast was filed down soft, and Laura, who had said no to her once, had her friend beside her now in the worst summer of her life, and I would guess that neither of them ever once mentioned the baby that had been asked for, because by then they both understood too much about wanting and losing to need to. The wheel turned on. It always does. And it did not stay in the dark, because life, mercifully, is made of far more than its hardest summers. Because let me take you now to a much brighter day, one with more than 70 people at the door. It was 1889 that same year, and it marked 20 years since a young farmer named Robert had married a young woman named Ella Rosina Peck back in Iowa. 20 years. And the town of De Smet, which by now knew exactly what it had in the Boasts, threw them the kind of party that tells you everything about how a couple is loved. The De Smet newspaper recorded it, which is how we know, and the number it recorded is the thing that stops you. Over 70 guests. 70. In a small prairie town where the whole population would have fit in a couple of church halls, more than 70 people put on their good clothes and came out to honour 20 years of one ordinary extraordinary marriage. Picture the house full to the walls and spilling out the doors. Picture Robert's laugh going off like a bell again and again, the way it had that first Christmas in the snow. Picture Ella moving through the crowd of them, this woman with no children, absolutely surrounded by people who loved her. Every one of them a kind of child of that open door of hers. If she had spent 20 years pouring her heart into other people instead of into a family of her own, then this was the day it all came flooding back to her at once. 70 strong, with cake. Picture who would have been in that crowd. The neighbours from up and down their road. The friends from town. The church people. The storekeepers. The other old settlers who had come in those first hard years and stuck it out. The Ingalls, naturally every one of them, Ma and Pa and the girls, right in the middle of the crush, and nearly every single person in that house was, in one way or another, someone the Boasts had fed, or helped, or laughed with, or sat up beside through a bad night. That is what 70 guests actually adds up to. In a town that small, it adds up to very nearly everyone. It means a whole community setting down its endless work for one afternoon to stand in a single couple's rooms and say, out loud to their faces, "We are glad you're here. We're glad you came out to this hard country and stayed. Our lives are warmer for having had you in them." Not many people ever get to hear a thing like that said plainly, in person, by 70 of their neighbours at one time. Ella Boast heard it, on that day, in that packed and happy house, 20 years a wife, entirely surrounded. That is the thing about a life like Ella's. From the inside, on the quiet evenings, it may have felt like a house with an empty room in it. But from the outside, on a day like this one, you could see the truth of it plainly. She was not a woman who had missed out on family. She was a woman who had made family out of a whole town by hand one warm afternoon at a time for 20 years, and on this day the town came and stood in her house and said so, all 70 of them. Robert stood beside her, 20 years married, still laughing, and whatever the quiet cost of her life had been, on this one bright day the ledger came out full and running over, and the door would not stay shut for all the friends trying to come through it. Not every goodbye in this story is a grave. Some of them are just a wagon going down a road in the wrong direction. By the early 1890s, Laura and Almanzo had taken about all the Dakota Prairie was willing to give them, which was not much. The drought would not break. The debts would not shrink. Almanzo's body would not mend past a certain point, and so, in the summer of 1894, they did the thing that so many broken-down homesteaders finally did. They loaded a covered wagon with what was left of their life, and they turned it south, toward a green corner of Missouri that the advertisements called the land of the Big Red Apple, to try the whole business of living all over again from the beginning. Rose was 7 years old now, a solemn, watchful girl who would remember that journey her whole life and write it down. Tucked into the wooden lap desk was a $100 bill, every cent they had in the world hidden away for the fresh start at the other end. There is a heart-stopping little moment on that trip where they think the bill has slipped away and been lost, and a long bad hour before they find it wedged in a crack of the desk. Their entire future nearly gone in a crack of wood. That is how thin the margin was. The journey ran about 650 miles and took the better part of 6 weeks. And somewhere at the start of it, in De Smet, was Ella Boast watching them go. Think about what that wagon carried from her point of view. It carried Laura, the quick brown girl she had known since Silver Lake, all grown up and worn down and starting over, and it carried Rose. It carried the very child that Ella had once held against her shoulder and asked, out loud, to keep. Now that child was 7 years old and riding away south, out of the town, out of the territory, out of Ella's daily reach for good. The baby she had wanted was going down the road in somebody else's wagon, exactly as babies do, and there was nothing to do but stand there and wave and mean it. The friendship did not break. Friendships in that era were built to survive distance, because distance was the one certain thing. They wrote letters. Laura and her mother and her sisters and the Boasts kept the threads running back and forth across half a country for the rest of their lives. But it was not the same as a door 2 streets over, and everyone knew it. Something soft went out of the daily texture of Ella's world when that wagon crossed the horizon. One more warm room she used to be able to walk into was closed to her now, except on paper. She was a woman who lived by the open door and the dropped-in visit, and the world, slowly, one wagon at a time, was moving some of her favourite doors out of reach. She did not know it yet, but her own world was about to start narrowing from the other direction too, and far more cruelly, because her own body was preparing to close some doors that no letter could keep open. It started in her hands, most likely, the way it so often does. A stiffness in the fingers in the morning that took longer and longer to work loose. A soreness in the joints that did not go away when the weather warmed. This was rheumatism, what today we would call rheumatoid arthritis, and in the 1890s there was nothing anyone could do about it but watch. It is a slow, patient, merciless thing. It settles into the joints and it swells them and it stiffens them, and over the years it can curl a working woman's hands into shapes that will no longer hold a needle or a spoon. It moves from the hands to the wrists to the knees to the hips. And in Ella Boast's case, over the closing years of that century, it did the worst thing it does. It took her feet out from under her. The woman who had walked in dry and helpful to a stranger's kitchen that first snowy night. The woman whose whole life had been motion and errands and crossing the street to help, slowly and then completely lost the ability to walk. Sit for a moment with what that meant for a woman like her and be gentle about it, because it deserves gentleness. Her entire self had been built around doing. Around the open door, the dropped-in visit, the meal carried over to a sick neighbour, the hands always busy on someone else's behalf. And now those same hands were curling closed, and those same feet would not carry her, and the doors she had spent a lifetime walking through were, one by one, becoming too far away. The pantry she used to work in, the gardens she used to tend, the friends across town she used to visit unannounced. All of it slid quietly out of her reach, an inch at a time, over years, while she was still entirely herself on the inside, still warm, still interested, still wanting to help and unable to. There was no more keeping the farm after that. A homestead is a thing you run with your body, and Ella no longer could, and Robert could not do it all and tend to her besides. So in the 1890s they let the farm go. The quarter section east of town that Robert had filed on back in that hopeful summer of 1879, the ground they had proved up and lived on and made their whole Dakota life upon. They sold it, and they moved into the town of De Smet itself, into a smaller house on 2nd Street, a house on level ground where a woman who could not walk could at least be wheeled from room to room. The lamp that had burned in the window of the surveyor's house, and then the claim shanty, and then the farmhouse, now burned in a little house in town, lower to the ground, close to the neighbours, easier to reach. It was a smaller life drawn in tight around her chair, and there was a particular grief folded up inside the larger one, the sort only a woman who has kept a place will completely understand. Ella lost her garden. A homestead garden was no hobby out there. It was half the family's food and the whole of a woman's pride, the long rows of beans and potatoes and squash, the few flowers coaxed up along the path for no reason at all, but a little beauty in a hard place. She had knelt in that dirt for years. She had put its harvest up in jars against the winter, had made that stubborn patch of Dakota ground answer to her 2 hands. And now those hands would not close around a trowel, and those knees would not fold to let her down to the rows, and the whole green kingdom of it slipped away from her, along with the farm it had grown beside. There is a special kind of ache in outliving your own usefulness at the very things you most love to do. Ella felt it. You can be sure of that. She simply did with it what she always did with an ache. She folded it up small and set it down somewhere the visitors would never see it, and she asked them instead all about their own gardens. But it was not, as you might fear, a lonely one. because Ella Boast had spent 30 years earning something without ever meaning to, and now it was going to be paid back to her, in full, by the man who had married her. Here is where Robert Boast becomes, to my mind, the true quiet hero of this whole story, and where that big rolling laugh of his turns out to have been resting on top of something even better underneath it. Because a marriage, in the end, is not really tested by the party with 70 guests. It is tested by the 10,000 ordinary mornings that come after, and most especially by the mornings when one of the two people can no longer do for themselves. That was the test that came to Robert Boast, and he passed it every single day for the better part of 20 years, without any fuss, in a way that half the town could see and the other half only guessed at. Picture the mornings in the little house on 2nd Street. Ella can no longer rise on her own, cannot dress her own body, cannot do up a button with those curled and swollen hands that had once done up 1,000 buttons for other people. So Robert does it. This farmer, this railroad man, this fellow with the booming laugh, learns the patient close work of caring for a body that will not cooperate. He learns how to lift her without hurting the sore joints. He learns how to ease her into her clothes. He learns the small, slow grammar of getting a person who cannot walk from the bed to the chair, and from the chair to the table, and he does it gently, and he does it again the next day, and the next, and the one after that, for years on end. There is a kind of love that announces itself, and there is a kind that just shows up before dawn and does the quiet work. And the second kind is the rarer and the finer of the two. And then, when she was washed and dressed and settled, on the good days, he took her out. This is the picture the town remembered, the one that comes down to us plainly, and I want you to see it the way de Smet saw it. On a fair afternoon, the door of the 2nd Street house would open, and out would come Robert Boast, pushing a wheeled chair, and in the chair, wrapped up warm with a shawl over her useless knees, would be Ella going visiting. He wheeled her along the wooden sidewalks of the town, the same sidewalks he would later clear of snow for everyone else, and he took her wherever she wanted to go. To this friend's house, and that one, to sit on a porch in the sun, and again over to see the Ingalls, because those friendships had lasted, and Ma Ingalls and the girls were still right there in de Smet, and a woman who cannot walk still needs her oldest friends more than she needs almost anything. So, the two families, who had met when everyone was young and strong and full of the future, kept meeting when everyone was older and greyer and a little broken. Ella came to them now in a chair, pushed by her husband, and they were glad to see her come, exactly as glad as they had been that first snowy Christmas, when it was she who did the helping. That is what a real friendship looks like when it goes the distance. The roles trade around. The one who carried you carries you, and then one day you carry her and nobody keeps score, because the whole point was never to keep score. Do you see the shape of the reversal, the beautiful symmetry of it? For 30 years, Ella Boast had been the one who showed up, the one at the sick bed, the one with the covered dish, the one whose hands were always busy on somebody else's behalf. She had poured herself out on a whole town and asked for nothing back. And now, when she could not lift a spoon, the town, and above all her own husband, poured it all back into her. Every kindness she had ever done came home to roost in that wheeled chair. The neighbours who called out to her on the sidewalk. The friends who kept their doors open for a woman who could no longer open her own. And Robert most of all up before her every morning, learning the tender craft of caring for the person he had married 40 years and a lifetime ago in a thick tangle of Iowa families. She had spent her love freely her whole life long, expecting no return. And it turned out she'd been making the best investment of her life the entire time, without ever once thinking of it that way. You know couples like this, I hope, even now. The old man pushing the old woman's chair through the grocery store slow, in no hurry at all, because where would they possibly need to be? The one feeding the other, patiently, a spoonful at a time, in a quiet kitchen. It does not look like much from the outside. It does not look like the grand romance in the pictures. It looks like a tired man doing up a button. But if you have lived any length of time at all, you know that it is the button, and not the wedding, that love is actually made of. Robert Boast knew it too. He just never said so. He only got up every morning and did it. And the town saw it, the way a small town sees just about everything. They saw Robert carrying the wood in for her. They saw him bring her cup to her hand. They saw the patience of it, morning after morning, year upon year. None of it was ever performed for anyone, mind you. He would have done every bit of it precisely the same if not one soul had ever been watching, because it was never for show, it was for her. But a town notices all the same, and it slowly changes the way they hold a man in their minds. Robert Boast had been the fellow with the big laugh, the good neighbour, the one who cleared the walks in winter. Now he quietly became something larger and steadier in the town's regard. One of those husbands that people nod toward and murmur, "Look how he is with her. Look how he never once complains." He had married Ella for better and for worse in a small Iowa ceremony half a lifetime before, and now, in the plainest daily way there is, he was showing a whole prairie town what those old worn words had actually been for. There is a laugh in this part of the story still, by the way. Do not imagine it as all gloom, because it was not. Robert never lost that laugh, and the visitors who came to the 2nd Street house came away remembering that the Boasts were still somehow good company. Ella in her chair was still Ella, still warm, still interested in every soul who came through the door, still wanting the news of everyone's children and grandchildren. Her body had closed like a fist over the years, slowly, joint by joint. Her heart had done the opposite. It had stayed wide open to the very end, an open door in a body that could no longer cross a room. And Robert wheeled that open door up and down the sunny streets of De Smet for as long as he possibly could, so that the town could keep coming to visit the warmest woman in it, even now, even like this. That was the shape of their days on 2nd Street, in the first years of the new century. A slow, patient tenderness, morning after morning, with the laugh still in it, and the old friends still calling. It was not the life they had ridden north to build back in 79. It was something they could not have imagined that first Christmas, harder and smaller and in its own way, even more of a marriage than the one they had started with, and the lamp still got lit each evening, and set where she could see it, and carried, when the day was done, to wherever she was going to sleep. The new century came in, and with it came the season of a long life that nobody warns you about. The season when the people you started out with begin, one by one, to leave. It began on a happy enough note. In 1901, Grace Ingalls got married. Grace, the baby of the family, the round-fair little girl who had been not quite 3 years old that first Christmas at Silver Lake. The child Ella had bounced on her knee and cooed over more times than anyone could count. That baby was a grown woman now, and she stood up in the parlour of her mother and father's house in De Smet and married a farmer named Nathan Dow. Ella Boast had watched that girl grow the whole way, from a toddler in a crowded warm house to a bride in a good dress. And if there was a sweeter and sadder feeling than watching the babies you loved become people who no longer needed watching, Ella would have known it, because she felt it now. Then, the very next year, the first true blow. On the 8th of June, 1902, Charles Ingalls died. Pa. He was 66 years old, and his heart simply gave out, there in the town he had helped to build. And for Robert Boast, this was not just the loss of a neighbour. This was the loss of the first friend he had made in all of Dakota, the man he had taken to on sight out at the railroad camp on the 1st of September back in 79, when they were both younger than their own children were now. More than 20 years those two men had been friends, through the hard winter and the good harvests and all the ordinary Sundays in between. And now Charles was gone, and Robert was one of the ones left standing at the graveside, and the great warm circle that had formed around that first lit window began, for the first time, to have a gap in it. Carolyn Ingalls was a widow now. Ma, who had run that full house of daughters with such a straight back and such a careful hand, lived on quietly in De Smet with her blind daughter Mary beside her, and the two families who had been young together were old together now, and grieving together, which is its own kind of intimacy. Ella came to Ma in her wheeled chair, pushed by Robert, and the two women who had talked over their mending 40 years before talked now about the ones who were gone. There is a particular closeness that only comes to people who have known each other so long that they share the same dead. The Boasts and the Ingalls had reached that country. They had buried Pa between them, and they held on to each other on the near side of it. And as the years of that new century went by, Ella watched something else unfold among the Ingalls girls she had loved, something so quiet that it is easy to miss, and so tender once you see it that it will stay with you. None of them, in the end, would have children of their own. Think of that. That whole house full of daughters that had once made the Ingalls home ring, the 4 girls Ella had ached over from her own quiet house. Mary, blind and brilliant, never married at all, and lived out her life with her mother. Grace married her farmer, and kept a good home with him, and had no children. Carrie, the small sharp one, would marry later in 1912, a widower out in the Black Hills with 2 young ones of his own, and she would be a fond stepmother to his children, but she would bear none herself. And Laura, away down in Missouri, had her Rose, and only Rose, the single child who lived. And Rose, in her turn, grown into a famous and restless writer, who saw half the world, would have no surviving children either. So the whole bright Ingalls line, all those daughters narrowed down over the years to 1, and then to none. Sit with the strange, gentle rhyme of that for a moment. Here was Ella Boast, who had wanted children more than she had ever let herself say, who had once asked out loud to be given one. And all around her, in the family she loved best in the world, were women who had children barely or not at all. The full house she used to walk home from, aching, had turned out to be far less full down the generations than it looked on those loud early evenings. It is not a thing you could have seen coming that first Christmas, with 4 girls underfoot and a baby on someone's knee. But life does this. It rhymes in ways you only notice at the end, when you look back and see that the woman who thought she was the only one with an empty place was in truth surrounded by others carrying quiet versions of the very same thing. They just never spoke of it. Women of that time so rarely did. So the letters came to carry the weight the dropped-in visits used to carry. Every few weeks a new one would arrive up from Missouri and be opened and read aloud in the small house on 2nd Street and answered in turn. Laura wrote of the farm at Mansfield, the apple trees slowly coming into bearing, the long hard climb up out of those terrible early years into something steadier at last. And there was always news of Rose, who was becoming letter by letter a person the size of the whole wide world. Rose in Kansas City, Rose out in San Francisco, Rose writing for the newspapers, Rose off to places with names that sounded like fairy tales when you read them from a chair on the northern prairie. Ella followed every mile of it. The baby she had once held against her shoulder and asked to keep had grown into a woman who would not sit still on 2 continents, and Ella, who could no longer walk the length of her own kitchen, followed that racing, far-off life the way you might follow a bird you had once held in your 2 hands and then opened them and let go. There was no bitterness in it. There was only a kind of wonder and a private particular pride, and that small old ache that never entirely left her, folded up neat and tucked away where it would trouble no one. Ella followed all of it from her chair, and she followed Laura and Rose from a greater distance still, by letter, across the 600 miles to Mansfield. The letters went back and forth for years, carrying the news that letters carry, the marriages and the deaths and the weather and the small triumphs. Rose was making a name out in the wide world, writing for newspapers, travelling to places Ella would never see and could now scarcely imagine, having lost the use of her legs. And I like to think that Ella, who had once asked to keep that very baby, took a particular private pride in how far that baby had flown. She did not get to raise Rose, but she had loved her from the start, from the first winter of her life, and she got to watch, from a wheelchair on 2nd Street, as the child she'd wanted grew into someone the whole country would eventually read. That is not the thing she asked for. But it was not nothing either. It was a kind of motherhood at a distance, the only kind the world had left her, and she took it and was glad of it. So the circle aged and thinned and held. Pa was gone. Ma and the girls carried on. The Boasts grew old on 2nd Street, she in her chair and he on his feet beside it, and the letters kept coming and going, north and south, carrying love the long way around, the way love so often has to travel when the doors you used to walk through have moved out of reach. You might think that a woman who could no longer walk would stay put, would let the world come to her on 2nd Street and go no farther than her own front porch. Ella Boast was not quite that kind of woman, and in 1904 she proved it by going all the way to Canada. Robert, remember, had come from far away up north, born up in Canada, and he had family still up there, brothers and cousins, and the whole other half of a life he had left behind as a young man to go farming in Iowa. The pull of that old family never quite lets go of a person, and in 1904 Robert and Ella made the long journey back up to visit his people. Now, understand what that meant for a woman in her condition in that year. This was hundreds of miles by train, changing cars, being lifted and settled and lifted again. A wheeled chair and a body full of stiff and painful joints, hauled the whole width of a continent and across a border, for no reason at all except love and the wish to see family faces while there was still time to see them. She did not have to go. She went anyway. That tells you everything about how much she still wanted to be among people she loved, and how little she would let her broken body have the final say about it. The trip did not go easily. While they were up in Canada, far from her own home and her own bed and her own doctor, Ella fell seriously ill. Not the slow, grinding illness of her joints, but something acute and frightening, and she was laid up, bedridden, for 5 long weeks before she was well enough to be moved and brought home again. 5 weeks! Imagine Robert through those weeks, a long way from De Smet, watching his wife sicken in a relative's spare room, not knowing if this was the illness that would take her, unable to do anything but sit by the bed and wait and tend her, the way he had learned to tend her, and hope. And then imagine the slow, careful journey home when at last she could travel, the two of them coming back down out of Canada to the house on 2nd Street, to the lamp in the window and the familiar rooms, both of them older and more frightened than when they had left. She had gone across the water for love, and it had nearly cost her everything, and she had come home. She would not make that journey again. But she had made it once, in a wheeled chair, when almost no one would have blamed her for staying home. That was Ella. And so the years settled into their long, quiet twilight, on 2nd Street, in the town they had helped to raise up out of bare grass. Think of what those two had watched happen, in one lifetime, from one place. When Robert and Ella first came to that country in 1879, there was almost nothing there. A shallow lake, a railroad camp, a surveyor's house standing alone on the shore, and grass to the edge of the world in every direction. And now, 30 and then 40 years on, they sat in a settled town, with streets and stores and a depot and churches, with neighbours they had known for decades, in a place that had a past now, a place where people could say, "I remember when." They had not just lived in De Smet, they had been there before it was De Smet. They were among the small handful of people left who could remember the empty prairie underneath all those buildings, the way you might remember the field a neighbourhood was built on. The world had turned itself over completely while they sat still and grew old, and they had watched the whole turning from their own front window. In 1909, Robert and Ella passed 40 years of marriage. 40 years since a young farmer married a pet girl back in the thick of those Iowa families. Most of it good, some of it very hard. The last stretch of it lived in a wheeled chair, with him doing up her buttons in the mornings. And still, by every account, they were good company, the two of them. Still glad of visitors, still holding whatever it is that two people hold on to across 40 years. Ma Ingalls was still just across town, older now too, and the old friends still came and went. Word still arrived by letter from the south, from Laura and from Rose, whose name was getting bigger in the world every year. Around this time, Laura even travelled clear out to San Francisco to visit Rose, who was making her way as a writer out on the coast, and you can be sure that news of that trip, of Laura going all the way to the Pacific to see the child Ella had once asked to keep, made its way back to a certain house on 2nd Street and was read aloud and marvelled over. This is what Happily Ever After actually looks like, by the way, when you get up close to it. Not a fairy tale. Not a couple frozen young and beautiful at the end of a story. It looks like two old people in a small house, in a small town, one of them in a chair, both of them tired, both of them having buried friends and dreams, and for Ella, the hope of children of her own. And it looks like them still choosing each other, every ordinary morning, still laughing sometimes, still each other's whole world after 40 years. If you are lucky, you have seen it somewhere, maybe in your own family, maybe in your own kitchen mirror. It is not a dramatic thing to look at. It is only the most durable love there is, the kind that outlasts the strong bodies and the big plans and settles down into something slower and truer. The Boasts had that. Whatever else they did not get, they got that all the way to the end. And they had one more thing besides, which is worth naming out loud, because it hides so easily underneath all the hardship. They had a long time. So many of the couples in this whole Prairie story got only a handful of years together before something took one of them away. A fever, an accident, a hard birth. The 1,000 ways that country cut a life short without warning. Robert and Ella got decades. They got to grow old together, which was no small or ordinary thing out there, and never once to be taken for granted. They got to become the old couple in the corner who could remember when the town was nothing but grass. They got to bore the young people if they liked, with the stories of the first Christmas and the first oysters and the hard winter, and to turn to each other and say, "Do you remember? Do you remember?" across a whole shared lifetime of things worth remembering. That is the reward almost no one thinks to count, the one that only comes to the couples lucky enough to last. The Boasts lasted. Whatever the final ledger of their life came to, it had that folded into the sum, a long, long time together, and there is no small number of people in this world who would trade nearly anything for that one thing alone. And the end, now, was beginning to come. Not with a storm this time, just with the slow running down of a long clock in a quiet house, with a lamp in the window. Let me slow all the way down here, and just spend an ordinary day with them in that little house in those last long years, because the ordinary days are the ones that actually make up a life. And the Boasts' ordinary days were quietly lovely, right up until the end. The day would start early, the way farm train days always do, no matter how far from the farm you get. Robert would be up first, in the grey light, and the first job of his morning was the stove. He would build the fire back up from the banked coals of the night before and set the kettle on, and let the kitchen begin to warm so that the room would be soft and heated by the time he brought Ella out to it. Then came the patient work, the lifting and the dressing, the careful movement of a body that had gone stiff overnight. He had done it so many thousands of times by now that it had its own rhythm, unhurried, practiced, tender. And then she would be settled in her chair by the window where the morning light came in, with a shawl across her knees and a cup of something warm within reach of her curled hands, and the day could begin. She could still do some things, and she did them, because a person needs to be useful, and Ella needed it more than most. Her hands were bad, but on the better days she could still manage a bit of handwork, some mending, some knitting she could feel her way through, the needle moving slowly where it had once flown. And what she could not do with her hands, she did with her voice and her memory. She ran that house from the chair. She knew where everything was. She told Robert where to find the good thread and how much flour was left and which neighbour was owed a visit. A kitchen does not stop being a woman's kingdom, just because she rules it now from a wheeled chair by the window, instead of from her own 2 feet. Ella Boast reigned over her small domain to the very last, and reigned kindly, and the house ran because she said how it should run. It is worth holding on to the next time you catch yourself picturing a life shrunk down to a few rooms and a wheeled chair, that a shrunken life is not at all the same thing as a small one. Ella's world had grown very small in its plain dimensions, a kitchen, a front room, a stretch of wooden sidewalk in fair weather. But the life she lived inside those few rooms was not small in the least. There was love in it, and work in it, and a steady tide of people flowing in and out of it, and news of a whole family scattered clear across a continent arriving by post. A great deal can happen in a few rooms. Whole worlds can turn inside them. Ella Boast proved that every single day, running her little kingdom from a chair by the window, more fully awake and alive at the centre of her few square feet than a great many people ever manage with the whole wide earth to roam. The mornings were for the work of the house, such as it was for 2 old people. The middle of the day was for the thing Ella loved best, which was company. And the company came. This was the great reward of a life spent with the door open. All those years she had walked into other people's kitchens uninvited and welcome. Now they walked into hers. Neighbours dropped by with a bit of news or a bit of baking. Old friends came to sit an hour. The minister likely, and the women of the church, and whoever had heard whatever was worth hearing that week. And Ella took it all in, hungry for it, wanting every detail of everyone's children and everyone's troubles, giving out sympathy and advice, and that warm, undivided attention that made people feel, when they left her, that they had been properly listened to for once. Her body had shrunk her world down to a few rooms. Her interest in people had not shrunk at all. If anything, it had grown, the way a fire pulls in close and burns brighter as it settles. Picture an afternoon in the good weather. Robert wheels her out, down the little ramp or over the threshold, out onto the wooden sidewalk and off into the town in the sun. Maybe they go to see Ma Ingalls, and the two old women sit together and talk about the ones who are gone and the ones who are far away while Robert stands by, or goes off on some errand and comes back for her. Maybe they just go along the street so Ella can see who is out and call a greeting and be greeted. A whole town's worth of people knew that chair and the man behind it, and knew to slow down and stop and pass the time. And here is a thing I find almost unbearably sweet. This was the same town, the same streets, where Robert would go out in the deep of winter with his horse and clear the snow off those very sidewalks for everyone. He knew those boardwalks in every season, because he pushed his wife along them in the summer and he cleared them for the neighbours in the winter. That is a man who had made his peace with exactly where he was and had decided to be useful and loving right there on those few blocks for as long as he was given. There was still laughter in it. I keep coming back to that laugh of his, because it never left, and it is the thread that runs from the very first night of this story all the way to the last. 40 years on, 50 years on, half froze in a snowdrift or old and grey on 2nd Street, Robert Boast could still fill a room with that big helpless laugh and set everyone else off with it, even now, even with his wife in a chair, and both of them nearer the end than the beginning. A house where somebody still laughs like that is not a sad house, whatever else is true of it. And people did not leave the Boast company feeling they had visited an invalid and her keeper. They left feeling they had spent an afternoon with two people who plainly, stubbornly, still delighted in each other and in everyone who came through the door. Then the light would go long and gold, and the visitors would go home to their suppers, and the town would quiet. Robert would wheel her back inside. There would be a simple supper, got mostly by him now, and eaten slow. And as the dark came down over the prairie the way it does, huge and clean and full of stars out there, the last chore of Robert's day would be the mirror of his first, the lamp lit and placed where her eyes could find it, the fire banked low for the night, and then the careful work in reverse, easing her out of the chair and into her bed, settling the sore joints as gently as he could, pulling the quilt up over the both of them. You do this enough thousands of times and it stops being a burden and becomes simply the shape of your love, the thing your hands know how to do. That was the shape of Robert Boast's love by then. It was a lit lamp and a banked fire and a quilt pulled up every single night for a woman who could not do any of it for herself. Nobody wrote it in a book. Nobody put it in the paper. It was just done in a small dark house on the northern prairie, night after night after night, until the nights ran out. And they were running out now. The year was coming, and it was close, when the lamp would be lit for the last time with both of them still in the house to see it. It came in 1918, after all those years in the wheeled chair, after the swollen joints and the curled hands and the 5 weeks bedridden in Canada, and the 10,000 mornings of being lifted and dressed and loved, Ella Boast died. She was, by then, nearly 50 years married to the man who had been doing up her buttons every dawn. And one of those mornings, the lifting and the dressing simply were not needed anymore, and the chair by the window sat empty, and Robert Boast was alone in the house for the first time in half a century. I'm going to hold still here for a moment, because a death like this one deserves stillness, and not a rush of words. Think of what left the world when Ella Boast left it. the girl from the tangle of Iowa families, the young wife who rode in out of a snowdrift toward a lit window, the woman who served oysters in a one-room shack and made it a feast, who kept the warmest house in the county, who loved a whole town's worth of children because she was given none of her own, who once held a baby against her shoulder and asked to keep it for her very own, and then handed it back and went on loving it anyway. The woman whose body closed like a fist over 20 slow years, while her heart stayed wide open the whole time. All of that, gone quiet, in a small house on 2nd Street, in the town she had helped to build out of empty grass. She had spent her love so freely for so long on so many, and at the end she was surrounded by people who loved her back, and tended to the last by a husband who never once, in all those years, made her feel like a burden. That is not a tragedy. It is a hard thing, and a sad thing, and it is also, when you stand back from it, a life very well spent. She was laid to rest in the cemetery on the rise southwest of town, and the whole town, you can be sure, felt the gap where she'd been. And Robert. Oh, Robert. Picture the mornings now. The man who had built the fire and warmed the kitchen and gone in to lift his wife, every single day for 20 years, waking in a house where there was no one to lift. His hands knew a whole language of care that suddenly had no one to speak it to. You would forgive an old man at that point for simply folding up and following her. But that was not Robert Boast's way, and here is the last thing I love about him. He kept going. He kept being useful. He stayed active in the town, among the neighbours he had cleared all those sidewalks for, and he did not disappear into his grief, because that had never been his nature. He had spent his whole life filling rooms and clearing paths and doing the next kind thing, and he went on doing it. A little slower now, a little quieter without that laugh having anyone to bounce off of, but he went on. He even went home one more time. In 1920, an old man now, Robert Boast, made his way back up to Canada one last time, to Quebec, to see his relatives, to stand among his own people in the country where his life had started, before it ended. And then he came back to De Smet, to the house on 2nd Street, to the rooms that still held the shape of her, and he lived out the little that was left. On the 15th of July, 1921, Robert Boast died at home. He had outlived his Ella by 3 years, which was probably about 2 years and 11 months longer than he wanted to. They carried him out to that same cemetery on the rise, and they laid him down right beside her, where he had always belonged, and where he has lain now for more than 100 years. 52 years after a young farmer married a pet girl in Iowa, the two of them were together again, and this time nothing at all was going to move either of them apart. The lamp in the window of the 2nd Street house went dark for good, and the long, faithful, laughing, aching, generous marriage of Robert and Ella Boast was over, and complete, and at rest. They are still there, by the way. That is the thing about this rise of ground southwest of the town. Nobody there has gone anywhere, and the friends they made are right there with them, which is where we are going, finally, to leave them, and to leave you, in the best company on the whole prairie. There is a cemetery on a low rise of ground southwest of De Smet, out where the prairie opens up again the way it must have looked to all of them when they first came. The wind moves through the grass there the same as it always has, and on that rise, close together, lie almost everyone you have spent tonight with. Robert and Ella Boast are there side by side, and a short way off lies Charles Ingalls, Pa, who went first of all of them, back in 1902. In the years after Robert followed, the rest of the family came, one by one, to that same quiet rise. Carolyn Ingalls, Ma, in 1924, Blind Mary a few years after that, Carrie and Grace, the baby of them all, the little girl who had been not quite 3 that first Christmas. They're all there now, the whole circle that formed around that first lit window on Silver Lake, resting within a stone's throw of one another on a hill above the town they made. And think of what that means for Ella, the woman who wanted children and was given none, the woman who was afraid, maybe, in her quietest moments of being alone. She does not lie alone out there, and she never has. She lies beside the husband who did up her buttons for 20 years, and a short walk from the family she loved so much that she once asked them for a piece of it to keep. In the end, the childless woman is surrounded forever by the family she chose and the family that chose her right back. She got her wish, in a way. Not the way she asked for it, but she is not, and never will be, alone on that hill. The friends she rode in toward out of the snow are keeping her company still, and they are in no hurry, and neither is she, and the grass goes on moving over all of them, gently, the way it always has. So let it go quiet now. Let the whole long day settle. You came in tonight out of the dark and the snow, toward a lamp lit in a window on the shore of a frozen lake. You warmed yourself by a stranger's fire and found out the stranger was a friend. You heard a laugh so big it filled the house and set everyone off with it. You stood in a pantry so full it felt like safety, and you sat crammed into a one-room shack eating oysters in the middle of the snow, laughing, elbow to elbow with people you had only just met. You watched a friendship take root and hold through the worst winter the prairie ever threw at anyone. You saw a woman with an empty house love a house full of other people's daughters. You were in the room, quiet in the corner, when she held a baby and asked, out loud, to keep her. And you understood, didn't you? Exactly why. You watched her hands slowly close, and you watched a man learn to be gentle every single morning for 20 years. You were wheeled through the sunny streets of a little town where everyone knew the chair and the man behind it, and you watched a lamp get lit and carried and set down night after night until the nights ran out. They were only people, that is the whole of it, and it is enough. Robert and Ella Boast were only two ordinary people who wanted what nearly all of us quietly want. Someone to laugh with, somewhere warm to belong, a little one to love. They got two of those three in full measure, and the third they made peace with, and they gave away more warmth in one lifetime than most people manage who get everything they ask for. Proud and hopeful and kind and sure of tomorrow, the way we all are, the way you are, lying there right now. And now, in your own bed, which holds its heat all night and asks nothing of you at all, let yourself feel how lucky that quiet really is. No sled stuck in the snow, no long road still to travel tonight, nothing pulling at your sleeve, just the warmth and the dark and the good soft weight of being done for the day. Rest easy now. The snow that stopped their sled fell almost 150 years ago, and it melted long, long ago, and every hard winter in this story is over and cannot reach you. Ella has her Robert, and her friends, and her rise above the prairie, and she is not alone, and neither are you. You have nowhere to be, and nothing to do, but sleep. Good night.